Yes, welcome back. Well, governments are facing increasing pressure to rapidly scale up action on global warming, as a UN report warns humans are having an unequivocal impact on the climate. We're going to be simultaneously underwater and on fire. The latest global review from the Intra-Governmental Panel on Climate Change said the world will reach or exceed temperature rises of 1.5 degrees Celsius, seen as a threshold beyond which the worst impacts of global warming will be felt. So that's going to happen, apparently, over the next 2 decades. In order to combat climate change, governments are proposing a greener economy. But the big question is, at what cost?
Yes, well, to discuss this is Professor Rupert Reid, author of Parents for a Future, and Andrew Montford, Deputy Director of the Global Warming Policy Forum. Thank you both for joining us. Andrew, let me start with you. Boris Johnson's green agenda is reportedly being plunged into chaos because, people are saying the poorest will pay for this. Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. They have essentially not really been very straight with the public about what the costs will be. There's banded around like 1.2 trillion, 1.3 trillion, which is about £30,000 per household. But you don't actually need to go into the numbers in very great detail to realise that isn't even remotely plausible. It will be, I would say, probably 4 to 5 times more than that. I've done a costing of some of the big areas that need to be done, so transport, domestic heat, and the energy system. And I'm up to 3 trillion. That's £100,000 per household already. Okay, by the time I finish the rest of the economy, it's going to be a lot more. So those are the kind of numbers that you can't shift around very easily. You can't just sort of shift that sort of cost from the poor to the rich. There's just too much money to be spent. It's quite interesting coming after your a couple of segments ago on your show, when you were talking about the financial crisis in the NHS. And at the same time as we have that, we're talking about spending these crazy sums of money trying to change the weather in 2050.
Absolutely, yes. Well, look, we're going to flick over now and ask for your take on it, please, because look, this is clearly an issue. I think if poor people are the ones who are going to foot the cost now, Rupert, for what is essentially, Boris Johnson's big green plan, as it were, that's a massive issue for people. When I suppose you could argue that some of the wealthiest people in the world are jetting themselves into space at the moment during a global pandemic. Can't they foot the bill?
Well, exactly. What I would like to see is the costs of the net zero transition being shouldered by fossil companies and the rich. Mr. Montford says that's not possible. Perhaps the reality is just that that's what he doesn't want. He stands for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, who are opaquely funded, but so far as we can tell, they are funded by the rich and quite possibly by fossil fuel companies. His funders wouldn't want to pay for this, so that's why he wants to talk about whether poor people might have to pay for it. I would like his funders to have to pay for it. It's no surprise that he doesn't want that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, isn't this essentially what part of the massive problem, which is, currently, Andrew, we end up in a situation where, if you want to drive into Birmingham, you have to pay about £8 a day. If you don't, then you end up getting fined. You have to kind of re-insulate your house. You have to go and get a smart meter. All of this stuff, right? That actually it's a little guy footing the cost, isn't it, for actually what is not really their problem in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the costs, we've just come through a big furore over heat pumps, 10 to £12,000 per household just to get the thing installed. You probably need to have 20, 30, £40,000 of insulation works for a lot of people. And also people don't realise the cost of the heat pump. You have to, that every time you need to replace the heat pump, you have to pay that extra cost again. It's not £1,000 for a new boiler. It's £5,000 to £6,000 for a new heat pump. So this, these costs are ongoing. It's the same with electric vehicles. Every time you need a new electric car, it's £10,000 more expensive. Rupert can sort of try to talk about our organisation's funding, but you can't get away from these costs. I mean, this is what Boris Johnson has just come up again, that people say it's cheap and it'll work and there'll be huge benefits, but as soon as real people in real households with real financial difficulties start to see what they have to spend, they realise that it's impossible.
And Rupert, what do you say to that?
Well, yes, I would like to talk a little more about your funding. Would you be willing, Andrew, to categorically deny here and now, because you've been completely opaque about your funding, that you are in fact in receipt of some funding from fossil fuel interests? Because I bet your viewers would be very interested to know that, because if it turns out that fossil fuel companies are directly or indirectly behind you coming on here and saying these things, then they wouldn't be very likely to take seriously what you're saying, would they? The reality is that the climate issue is coming at all of us hard and fast. Conservative Minister Alok Sharma has now said we are headed for climate catastrophe. That is why we are here talking about this. Forgive me for saying this, but what Alok Sharma is now admitting and this UN report is saying shows that people like me have been right about this issue across the years, and people like you have been wrong, Mr. Montfort.
Can I just go in and just say, Alec, you're right that Alok Sharma is saying that. You're right, Rupert. Absolutely, you're right that he's saying that. But also, Alok Sharma has, racked up more air miles than anyone I've ever known in my life during the climate crisis. You also end up in a situation where Boris Johnson's own climate spokeswoman won't get rid of her diesel car. She's not going to get an electric car. And you see the kind of G7 lot jetting all over the world, don't you? I just wonder, well, until this lot start practicing what they preach, why should I?
Look, I'm not here to defend the Conservative government. I think that they are the worst people possible, except for the Global Warming Policy Foundation, to be in charge at this time. What I'm saying is that even they are admitting now, essentially, that people like me are right and that people like Mr. Montfort have been wrong and are on the wrong side of history. Is Mr. Montfort willing to apologise for his systematic misrepresentations of the climate science in the past? And will he come clean about who his funders are being? Who are his puppet masters here today?
Andrew, obviously I have to give you the right of reply there.
Well, we have said categorically for the last 10 years we don't accept money from fossil fuel companies. Indeed, we don't.
Then show us your
money
accounts.
From energy No, let me finish. Thank you.
Show us your accounts. Prove it.
We don't accept funding from anybody with an interest in an energy company. So it's wider than just fossil fuel. We said this categorically for 10 years. The only reason Rupert wants to know is because Rupert likes to organise mobs to come round to people's offices and vandalise them, as he did last year when he came round to our offices in Tufton Street with a mob and spray painted the front. Now, here's a question for you at GB News. Why do you let people like that on air?
Yeah, just Rupert, just to flip that on his head, I think, by the way, you're perfectly entitled as anyone is to ask, who funds someone, basically. I'm not getting at you with that. What I would say is that the flip side of it is when it comes to the Extinction Rebellion lot and a lot of the eco-warriors, they actually don't just want the, environmental restrictions, as it were, to save the planet. They also do, to be fair, want the total destruction of our political system as we know it. And so, in that sense, there's a lot going on behind the scenes on both sides, isn't there?
What Extinction Rebellion are calling for, and by the way, Extinction Rebellion are completely open about their funding, unlike Mr. Montfort.
They are. They're less open, to be fair, about the fact that they have massive political ambitions, and some of those essentially do look a lot like anarchy.
I'm coming to that. What Extinction Rebellion are calling for is for there to be citizens' assemblies to decide how to go forward. You talk about the total destruction of our political system. That's not what XR are calling for. What they are saying is the political system as we know it has categorically failed us on climate. It's time to hand it over to citizens to decide. And I think that many of your viewers, when they understand that, will think, well, actually, that makes quite a lot of sense. Politicians have failed on this issue. Why shouldn't we have the chance to address it? They've done it in France. Why can't we do it here?
But it is the case that, people in this country is not the biggest polluter by any stretch of the imagination. The likes of China are still opening coal stations, for example. And the estimated cost is, I know you say trillions there, Andrew, but 94 billion is what it's estimated, just 46 billion to install chargers, for example, across the UK for electric vehicles. Isn't it eventually going to come down to essentially the government will have to subsidise all these things for poor people, and then that's going to probably be footed on, the bill will land on the taxpayer's desk, won't it? And quite frankly, I don't want to pay extra because the government's tried to impose something on the British people and then figured out that it's actually going to cost quite a lot of money, and many people will not be able to afford it out of their own pockets. Andrew?
The thing is, it'll just come out of, you say it's going to come out of taxes. Of course, people are still paying for that. Taxes have to come from people. So the cost is unavoidable. You will pay for it one way or the other. but you can't make the costs go away. We need transparency on the costs, and the government won't let anybody see how they've arrived at these numbers. I've just spent 2 years trying to get the calculations out of the Committee on Climate Change. Once you get up to costs of £100,000 per household, £200,000 per household, you're getting in sort of, you have to ask yourself the question of whether this is greater or less than the alleged damage that we're going to get from climate change. Now, I mean, Rupert can talk about catastrophe and apocalypse as environmentalists tend to do.
Not me, it's
but if we actually look around us, what is going on? Temperatures in the UK, according to the Central England Temperature Record, which is the Met Office's preferred measure for climate studies of the UK, temperatures haven't changed for 30 years. We can look around the world and see good news everywhere. The crop yields are increasing across the world.
Yeah, Rupert,
just
to cut in here,
almost every year.
Yeah, okay, all right. Just cut in here, Rupert. I've got to ask you. The people who care about climate change, the people who can afford to care about climate change. Okay, there's a lot of people on the breadline, especially now. Unemployment surging, etc. People have been on furlough. I mean, we've lived through probably the worst 18 months in living memory, pretty much, okay? And actually, it's only people who maybe got to spare 40 grand to buy an electric car that can actually care about it. Most people are just bothered about putting food on the table, and perhaps that's why, this radical notion of environmentalism is just not taking hold.
Well,
I think that's right. I mean, at the moment,
it's my turn now, Mr. Montford.
Rupert,
your concern at GB News for the poor is touching, but forgive me for a little bit of scepticism, given that you are funded by a firm based in a foreign tax haven and a hedge fund billionaire. Now, if we turn to the actual issue, Mr. Montford says there is good news all around the world. I wonder if people in Greece would regard the fires right now as good news.
Just answer the question that I asked. Greece. Okay, just answer the question I asked. Only people who've got a bit of spare cash can afford to care about climate change, can't they?
Would regard that as good news. It is quite appalling for Mr. Montford to say there is good news all around the world where climate chaos is killing people right now in multiple continents. That is the reality, and it is coming for us in the UK. We saw the flash floods recently. What Mr. Montford really wants, if you understand this, if you boil down to the reality of it, he wants inaction on climate, and that means he wants more people having sewage going through their homes.
Okay.
He wants more tube stations flooded. I don't think that's what ordinary working people in this country want.
No, Rupert, just very quickly and finally, what car do you drive?
I don't own a car. Right now, I'm moving temporarily hired car. I'm planning to get an electric car. But with all due respect, that's not the issue. The issue is what we're going to do as a society. What we're going to do. Are we going to pull together to face this or not? Are we going to go down the road of inaction, which Mr. Montford proposes, which will be fatal?
Well, Rupert and Andrew, it's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for both putting your sides across. Thank you for joining us.